A new manager cuts 5 hours of pay from a hardworking dispatcher's check, hours he actually worked. When he pushes back, the manager tells him it's the letter of the law. Fine, two can play that game. Over the next 2 months, our narrator uses that exact phrase to dismantle his manager's entire operation. His overtime, his vacation, his weekends, and eventually his job. And when that manager tries to torch his reputation on the way out, one recording brings the whole thing crashing down on him instead. This is petty justice. Before the fight starts, you need to understand how fragile this office already was. Picture a small plumbing company, dispatch office, 3 people running the whole show. Scheduling, dispatching technicians, ordering parts, handling emergency calls around the clock, 6 days a week plus after-hours coverage. Everyone officially held the same job title, dispatcher. There was our narrator, let's call him Dan, 30-something, flexible, easygoing about his hours. There was Ashley, a single mom juggling 3 kids and constantly ducking out for school pickups and appointments. And there was Howard, older, set in his ways, living with his elderly parents 4 days a week under a strict arrangement with his sister. 3 people, 3 completely different schedules, somehow making it work for years. Then Ashley wrecked it. Turns out Ashley had been quietly inflating a coworker's timesheet, a plumber she happened to be involved with, while the two of them ran cash side jobs on the weekend and pocketed a discount off the books. It unraveled when a customer called about a warranty issue and there was no record of the job anywhere in the system. Head office pulled the truck's GPS logs. The math didn't add up, both of them were fired on the spot. And just like that, Dan and Howard were the entire office, 2 people running what used to take 3, with no time off, no backup, and no relief in sight. They were told, temporary arrangement until we find a replacement. That replacement showed up in September. Let's call him Steve, brought in officially to fix the administrative mess that had piled up while Dan and Howard were drowning just trying to keep the phones answered. Instead, Steve walked in like he owned the place. Loud, aggressive, foul-mouthed from day one, announcing he was there to whip everyone into shape. He took over vendor relationships, parts ordering, payroll, and immediately started making Dan's life miserable. Dan asked for time off twice, denied twice. This despite having a contract that guaranteed him 3 weeks of vacation a year, of which he'd used exactly 2 days. By late November, Steve had only gotten worse. Then he made the mistake that changed everything. Dan checked his paycheck and found himself 5 hours short. Not regular hours, overtime hours. Real hours he'd actually worked covering emergency calls. He confronted Steve directly. Steve's explanation, he'd been told to cut down overtime company-wide, and conveniently, he'd started deducting 30 minutes a day from Dan's pay as an unpaid lunch break. One small problem, Dan never took a lunch break. He ate a sandwich at his desk and kept working, he said as much. Steve's response, more or less, doesn't matter, it's the letter of the law, take it up with the labor board, famous last words. Because Dan actually knew someone who could tell him exactly what the labor board would say. His friend Eric, a lawyer. Over beers and wings that weekend, Eric confirmed something Steve clearly hadn't thought through. If Steve was going to enforce every technical rule to the letter, Dan could too. Dan bought a small voice recorder, and he got to work. The following Wednesday, right at 4 p.m., the exact moment Steve had docked his payfor, Dan grabbed his lunch and walked out to his car. 10 minutes later, Steve came storming into the parking lot demanding to know what he thought he was doing. Taking my lunch break, Dan told him. Phones were ringing off the hook inside, didn't matter. Dan rolled up his window and finished his sandwich. Steve stomped back inside, furious, and with absolutely no comeback because Dan was simply doing exactly what Steve's own paycheck deduction implied he was entitled to do. An email arrived minutes later demanding Dan move his break earlier. Dan's reply, copied straight to HR and the owner, cited labor law directly. He wasn't legally entitled to a break until 5 hours into his shift. He'd be taking his 30 minutes at 4 p.m. every day, as required. Then Dan went further. He sent Steve a formal email again, copying HR and the owner, withdrawing his consent to the temporary schedule he'd been working under for months. Since Steve was now fully settled in, there was no longer any reason for Dan to keep covering the extra hours he'd agreed to only until a replacement was found. Monday, Dan reverted straight back to his original contracted hours. Steve was livid. Dan's answer was simple. The contract is the letter of the law too. Want to change my hours permanently? Fine, let's renegotiate, including my pay rate. Steve refused to negotiate anything, so Dan just worked his contracted hours. And every single email Steve sent trying to pressure him into extra time, Dan replied to cheerfully, copying ownership and HR on every single response, creating a paper trail a mile long. Here's where it gets good. Steve, thinking he was being clever, told Dan to just keep working through some late calls that week, not realizing he was digging his own grave. Dan tracked every hour. By Thursday morning, he was sitting at 39.5 hours for the week. He sent one more email, copying the bosses as always. At 12:30 p.m. today, I hit 44 hours. Per your own directive banning overtime, I'll need to leave at that point unless told otherwise. Right before hitting send, Dan turned to Howard and said, "You might want to make some popcorn." Steve exploded. He was trapped. Either eat the overtime he'd been ordered to prevent or lose his only dispatcher for the rest of the week, including the weekend. He ordered Dan to work Saturday and Sunday both. Dan calmly reminded him labor law guarantees 1 day off in 7. He'd worked last Sunday. This Sunday was legally his. Steve begged. His kid had a tournament that Sunday. He needed to be there. "Sorry," Dan told him. "It's the letter of the law." Monday, ownership and HR called Dan in. Steve was pushing hard to get him fired, painting him as insubordinate. Dan calmly laid out every email, every policy, every rule Steve himself had put in writing. The owner turned to Steve. "I never told you to cut overtime like this." Then Dan dropped the real bomb. He was taking his remaining 3 weeks of vacation, all of it for the rest of December. Steve lost it completely, screaming that he wasn't approving a single minute of it, that he was taking his own family to Florida and there'd be no one left to run the office. And there it was. Steve, 3 months into the job, was demanding vacation for himself while denying a full year's earned vacation to the person who'd kept the place running for years. HR tried offering a payout instead of the actual time off. Dan declined. They offered rolling it into next year. Dan declined that too. Legally, he was owed the time this year and he wanted the time, not a workaround. He took his 3 weeks, spent it relaxing with family, did absolutely nothing productive on purpose. Dan came back in January to find someone else sitting at his desk, and Steve waiting with his separation papers and a smug grin. HR listed the reason as laid off, not fired, a small technicality that would matter more than anyone in that room realized. A few days later, a reference check call came in for Dan's next job application. Steve answered and immediately launched into a tirade, badmouthing Dan, inventing complaints, going off for a solid minute straight. Then a voice on the other end said, "Hey Steve, recognize my voice?" It was Dan on speakerphone in a conference room at a law firm. Steve froze. Dan told him exactly where the call was being placed from and that the next call would be straight to the owner's lawyer. That single moment, the illegal reference call, laced with lies, became the final piece of a mounting wrongful dismissal case. Combined with every timestamped email Dan had carefully copied to HR for months, plus the recordings from his little spy pen capturing Steve's rants in real time, Steve had, without realizing it, built the entire case against himself. A settlement meeting was arranged. Dan's lawyer laid out the timeline, the emails, and finally a supercut of Steve's recorded outbursts, rant after rant after rant. Steve reportedly went white. The owner just stared at him. The company offered 3 months severance. Dan's side declined and played the recording of the illegal reference call again, mentioning multiple witnesses were prepared to confirm it under oath. The offer jumped to 6 months. Dan's side countered with 2 years. They settled at 15 months of severance, paid out bi-weekly like a regular paycheck, calculated against Dan's actual average hours, overtime included. Dan found a new job almost immediately at a competitor doing the exact same work, which means for over a year he was getting paid twice. Steve thought the letter of the law was a weapon only he could use, a way to squeeze a few extra dollars out of an employee who couldn't fight back. He picked the wrong dispatcher. Every rule he tried to use against Dan got turned back around, word for word, until the only thing left standing was a paper trail, a recording, and a very expensive lesson in what happens when you play games with someone's paycheck. If you liked this one, there's a whole pool of stories like it waiting for you. Malicious Compliance, Entitled People, Revenge That Actually Lands. Subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.